Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar. The topic for which today is the QA role, supporting DevOps the smart way. Our speaker for the day is Melissa Tondi. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm super excited to host you all and Melissa on our STP webinars. Quick information for all of you. The next upcoming conference we have is Spring 2019 STP Con, which will be held at San Francisco from April 1st to 4th this year. The program is up for your review. The topics range across automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, DevOps, performance testing, leadership, mobile testing, security, and many more. If you plan to attend the upcoming conference, don't forget, there are various offers for alumni attendees and team registrations. Should you have queries, do email them to info@softwaretestpro.com. And on that note, Melissa, I'll come to you because you are one of the regular speakers and in fact, most sought after speakers at STP. Did you get a chance to look at the conference program and any selections so far on what sessions and workshops you are looking forward to?
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me. I always enjoy these webinars. And of course, I always enjoy the STP cons, whether they're East or West. And I'm especially looking forward to this conference. As I was looking through the schedule over the last couple of days, of course, being on the DevOps track here, I'm really looking forward to Brendan Connolly's session around panoramic quality, the fellowship of testing in DevOps. And outside of the title, which I think is a fabulous title, the content really kind of talks very much aligned with some of the topics that we're going to be talking about in my webinar today. So I'm really looking forward to listening to what Brendan has to say. Another session that I was really interested in and intrigued me is by Sue Jadonzinski. Sorry, I probably didn't say her last name correctly, but she's talking about using Agile to adapt to changing goals. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we can really tap into some of the Agile principles and structure and not just use it for the standard project management or SDLC framework. I think there's a lot of things that we can tap into, and I look forward to hearing what Sue has to say on that topic as well.
Very nice selections. In fact, I was also planning to go to both of these, so good there. I saw you have 2 sessions, and I know that your sessions are always hugely popular. So do you want to share some backdrop to what you are going to speak on?
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, I'll be speaking on this particular topic at STPCon as well. The QA role, as most of us do, we kind of make sure our content is as fresh and topical as possible. So there will likely be some additions, even between me presenting today in the webinar and me presenting at the conference. So I'll be talking about this topic. And then I'll also be talking about what we've kind of affectionately been calling the do nots of testing. And that session focuses on 5 practices or opinions that we've had in QA that really should be revisited and certainly retuned, if not eliminated from our overall QA strategy. When they first started, they were good ideas and they kind of had the successful outcomes, but they've become stale in our overall strategy and within the industry. And I talk about some of the effects that they've had and then ways to address them and either retune them or maybe eliminate them and replace them with something that's a little bit more modern and innovative.
Wow, both of them sound so interesting, but definitely with the 10-year challenge being so popular, I think the session will be very interesting to go to see how things have changed. Yeah. All right. So moving on to our next piece of information. There is an upcoming Ask Me Anything AMA session with none other than the hugely popular leader, Michael Bolton, on 27th of February. So I seriously request all the attendees to please send in their questions, which we shall share with Michael during the live session. Your opportunity to get into the gate is higher right now. So send in your questions as soon as you can, because we'll have time will be limited for only so many questions. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar and the upcoming AMA with your followers and connections. You can also add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is @SoftwareTestPro. You can also note down Melissa's Twitter handle, which is Melissa Tondi, @Melissa Tondi. All right, let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Melissa. We are very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Melissa Tondi has spent most of her career working within software testing teams. She is the founder of Denver Mobile and Quality, DMAC, board member of Software Quality Association of Denver, SQUAD, and manager of consultants at Rainforest QA, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software, from design to delivery and everything in between. In her software test and quality engineering careers, Melissa has focused on building and organizing teams around three major tenets: efficiency, innovation, and culture, and has created the Great Common Denominator, the GCD approach, for determining ways in which team members can assess, implement, and report on day-to-day activities, so the gap between need and value is as small as possible. So let me transfer the control to you now, Melissa. A very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours.
All right. Everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I love these community webinars. It allows our speakers to kind of talk a little bit more intimately about some of the topics that we've been thinking about. And as probably all of you have been thinking about, DevOps has been one of those lingering topics that is either very, very new to your organization, or in some cases maybe implemented but perhaps misunderstood, especially as we start thinking about the role of QA and how do we support DevOps. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences and areas that QA and or QE can support the role of DevOps and any kind of approaches that either are in place within your company or organization, or if they're planning on being. So let's start. So why me? As Smita mentioned in my bio, I've been devoted to quality, and I do say capital Q, within the SDLC. So all functions within the SDLC. But my main experience for the majority of my career has been within the quality assurance, quality engineering space, as well as Agile spaces. But I've had a lot of practitioner experience as a tester, as a quality assurance engineer, and then moving into kind of management and leadership roles over the last few years. And I've really spent my career focusing on three tenets when I'm either consulting with or building teams. And those are efficiency, innovation, and culture. So if you've ever heard me speak, or if you've ever heard any of the webinars that I've done over the past few years, any one of these three, if not all three of these tenets, will kind of be thematic throughout some of the content. And this session is no exception. So what are we talking about? So we're going to define the QE role. A lot of times when I make a differentiation between quality assurance and quality engineering, I get several questions on what is the difference, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that just so we can level set and make sure that we are all aligned with terminology. We're also going to talk about retuning automation and what that means, and how automation, especially from a DevOps approach and standpoint, you'll hear automation as being one of the forefront tenets for successful DevOps. And when we think about supporting DevOps initiatives from a QA standpoint, that really is no exception. The same reason why we would look at investing and using test automation concepts to make QE and QA tasks more efficient and more innovative, it's the same for as we support DevOps. And then we're going to talk a little bit about shifting some of those traditional QA or QE tasks that have generally lived on the right side of the SDLC, as in kind of moving closer to the user. We're going to talk about shifting those a lot closer to the development and engineering side of that, so that we can get more and more valuable and quicker feedback and information as we start interacting with the software that we're testing. And then we'll talk a little bit about redefining refining. And if you've heard of some of the agile ceremonies around refinement or grooming, we're going to talk about how some ways that we've been successful by redefining the refinement meetings and making sure that we're using those as efficiently as possible for all members of the team that have responsibilities on work expected, either within a sprint or if you adopt some Kanban methods. But we're really talking about putting a lot more emphasis on what refinement should be used for. And then we're going to talk about making it shippable. And Shippable is, I'll talk about my opinions on Shippable and some of the things that we've put in place that have made it highly successful, not only from a QA or QE standpoint, but within the entire SDLC project team. So let's get started. So when we talk about quality engineering or QE, I tend to think about it as the new QA. And it's not necessarily a title or a role. So if you do not have QE or quality engineering in your title, that doesn't mean that you are not emboldening or adopting a lot of the characteristics of a quality engineer. But the best way that I can describe the quality engineering future state and certainly utopian state is this quote right here. We influence the building of the software before the software is built. And that means that we have a lot of skill and expertise, not only in our craft of quality assurance or software testing, but we also have technical aptitude. So we're technologists at the forefront. And as technologists, we should be early adopters and embracers of all tools and technology that make sense to make our day-to-day more efficient and more innovative. So it really, much like DevOps has been described by many thought leaders, quality engineering is a mindset. So even if you don't have that title of quality engineer, you can still be a QE with adopting some of the mindsets that we go through. Another way to kind of describe it is that it balances both technical acumen with user advocacy, and we put equal emphasis on both. So we know that as software testers, one of the best things that we can do is provide information back to the team as we're interacting with and exploring the software. And so you'll hear me use those terms, interacting with and exploring the software. When we think about what those terms mean, we really are acting on behalf of our users and are advocating for our users. So if we say one of the main components and highest value activities that we can provide as testers and quality engineers around user advocacy, a lot of times what happens is we get challenged or blocks because we may not have enough time to actually explore the software and advocate for our users as we should. And so that's why we balance the technical acumen with that. So by being early adopters and embracers of tools and technology, we can then make our day-to-day testing activities, especially the ones that are repetitive or maybe rote in some ways, we can make those much more innovative by automating them, or at least determining whether they should be automated so that we can consistently explore and advocate for our users. So when we talk about what the difference is between a quality engineer in this kind of modern, innovative way, we really are talking about balancing technical acumen with user advocacy. And that really then makes us influential throughout the SDLC. So if we use that initial quote of being influential in the building of the software before the software is built, you can see that for those who may be struggling with the throw it over the fence type of approach sometimes that we see, where sometimes QA or the testing team has not even seen anything until that coding is done and it's supposedly ready for test. The quality engineering mindset really makes us way more efficient within the SDLC. That's, again, so that we can be influential in the building of the software, because we've come to the table with a lot of valuable information and technical and user advocacy testing skill sets, so that we become way more influential throughout the SDLC versus where we tend to be more influential, which is during the actual testing period or phase of within the SDLC, especially if we're looking at agile components of sprints, from that aspect. So Let's talk a little bit about test automation. If you've heard me speak, you've probably heard this quote many, many times. I still love this quote, and I still think that it really embodies certainly my opinion on what test automation value provides to us. Test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. So going back to the mindset and characteristics of a quality engineer, that really makes a lot of sense because we are now using and adopting test automation methods and approaches so that we can then be more exploratory and advocating for our users. So we're balancing that technical acumen with the user advocacy by employing very popular techniques such as test automation. So when we think about what test automation has been, it's still in a lot of ways like this, but when we look at supporting DevOps and some of the mantras around automate everything or automate most things, which kind of tends to follow the DevOps characteristics, we need to start thinking about how do we retune our test automation so that it can be much more supportive of the DevOps approach. So generally, when we think about monolithic, or when we think about automation, it tends to be monolithic. And what I mean by monolithic is that we generally tend to have very large and very cumbersome end-to-end suites that they may run in the background, or we may schedule them to be run once or twice a day at set times, simply because in a lot of cases those suites take such a long time to run that it may be detrimental or may impact other testing activities that are being done on those environments. So because of that, we may have suites of tests that run for hours at a time. And when you start thinking about not only the value that those provide, and not suggesting that they don't provide value, but when we start looking at moving some of the information and communication as quickly left and as instantaneous as possible, monolithic suites that run for hours at a time are not one of those areas that really tend to support the DevOps. We want them to be much more tiered approach, right? So instead of having one or possibly two long suites of automation that must be run at certain times because they'll impact other testing activities, as I mentioned earlier, we want to start looking at that as being a tiered approach. We like to call that multiple runs for multiple dones, right? So although we look at getting smarter with how we organize our automation, ways that we can do that is by looking at starting small and starting from a basic building block of a smoke test, following what we like to recommend a CRUD approach, a create, read, update, delete approach, and including those 4 actions where applicable for a feature, we start getting basic building blocks of tests. And so when we think about the term multiple runs for multiple dones, we really are talking about having those in much more chunkable or much more consumable methods so that they become a service and support to be provided to the development team. So instead of having a monolithic long-running suites of tests, we like to tier them out and make sure that they're chunked in ways that make sense to the organization of the development team that we're ideally supporting and are directly to the left of us. So we look at kind of focusing on everything, right? So we've heard a lot of times, automate everything, and that certainly it certainly exists in the DevOps mantra, but it has absolutely followed us and has been sometimes mandated within QA, QE, regardless of the SDLC approach that we are adopting. So whereas we would say automate as much as possible or automate everything, again, we want to kind of retune that to say, not necessarily automate everything, but make sure that what we're automating provides the most valuable information. And I put in here ASAP because, again, we know that there are specific time sessions that we will lose the attention of our engineers to the left. So for example, if we have a merge and check-in of code that's being done, and the first automated suite that validates the build or that allows us to start our testing and exploration of the software, if that's taking more than 10, 15 minutes, or in some cases a half an hour, we will lose the traction that we've had from that developer. And if they know that a suite of tests are going to take a half an hour, they may start something new, a different task. And by the time that automated suite runs and provides results, that developer may have gone on and have done 1 to 2 more tasks in there, and then we have to then kind of context switch if something fails and needs the attention of the developer. So instead of having that monolithic focus on everything approach, we really like to talk about providing the most valuable information as soon as possible. And we think about as soon as possible, informal studies have shown that anything around 5 minutes is probably a good session or a good timeline when we start thinking about time boxing out those automated suites. That's always been how we started, 5 minutes. And that really is going to be gauged to each individual engineer that may be required to step in. But essentially what we're talking about is really then repurposing and reorganizing those automated suites so that they're providing that best and most valuable information as soon as possible. And then we kind of then look at what it has been before. It's a numbers game, right? And so we focused on everything before, and sometimes we may be mandated or measured by having a certain percentage or numbers, and we kind of just, collectively call that the numbers game, whether you have a measurement or success criteria that's tied to a certain percentage of test cases that should be automated. We know that doesn't necessarily provide value. There's not anything that we can actually track back that says the more or higher percentage of test cases that have been automated therefore equals higher quality of code. And a lot of times when we are measured or mandated to keep a certain percentage of automated test cases as a measurement, we know that sometimes fosters some bad behavior, but also, more importantly, some cases fosters a false sense of the quality of the software. So a converse opinion on that then is to use the metric that we've instilled for a while now, called the A of A, the automated of automatable. And I've got a lot of content around that I'd be happy to share if anyone's not familiar with that concept. And if so, please reach out and we'll make sure that we get that information. But essentially, just to give a very quick understanding of what the A of A is, it is kind of going through a selection process using both industry standards on automation criteria and guidelines, but also your individual company or organization's standards for automation, and actually going through not only can it be automated, but should it be automated? And that collectively, using the A of A as that metric, gives a much cleaner and a much more valuable and realistic automation measure when we start thinking about that. Okay, so now we have to shift left to focus on the right. And when we talk about the right, I'm talking about the right tasks, right? And so we've heard there's a lot of people that have used, myself included, shifting left, and kind of, and the idea and the concept behind shifting left is to really make the SDLC pipeline much more collaborative and cohesive across the team. And a lot of times when we implement Agile, by simply saying we've adopted some sort of an Agile approach, sometimes we lose the benefits of what Agile actually brings us, which is highly collaborative, high teamwork. We focus on conversations versus massive pieces of documentation. I'm not going to read through the whole Agile manifesto, but you kind of get the idea. And I'm assuming that if you're not currently practicing Agile, most, if not all of you, are familiar with the key components of Agile. And of course, DevOps fits very nicely into the overall Agile umbrella, because it's focusing on again, more collaboration. Development and engineering have much more responsibilities around ensuring that their code and components are working on production, not simply on their own development or QA environment, right? And so that's part of one of the reasons why, one of the impetus, of course, of why DevOps has kind of been such a popular approach for overall software development and delivery. So when we think about shifting left to focus on the right tasks, let's talk a little bit about the wrong tasks, right? And so we tend to regression test at the end. This holds true for just about every organization. So, typically what happens is when the testing team gets a story or gets a piece of work that has been otherwise indicated as being dev complete, we start testing. We test that. We probably start out by testing either the requirements for traceability or acceptance criteria. We may do a little bit of exploration around that. And then we move on to the next story. We may try and break it. We may do some negative tests in there, and then we move on to the next story or the next piece of code or components that have been dev complete. And we kind of do that very cyclical, where we test one story, we move it to the next column, and then we test another story, and then we move that to the next column. And then at the end of that sprint or at the end of that cycle, when we get ready to release, we then put in a regression testing phase or cycle that may take anywhere from a half a day to, in some cases, 2 to 3 weeks. But the idea is that we focus on putting the regression testing at the end of either a sprint or a development cycle. So a right task to think about that is that we should be looking at regression testing throughout the development cycle and the testing cycle, and we should be including dev with those. So the best way for us to ensure that regression testing is not only not being done and waited until the very end, and by kind of shifting that to the left, but it's to shift it continuously throughout the SDLC pipeline. So one of the ways that we can do that is by sharing our tests with dev. Now, and sharing them may simply be to give them insight so that they can start looking at those tests either before or while they're writing their code, and that kind of lays the tracks for a TDD or test-driven development type of approach. Or we can have those automated tests readily available and centralized to the development team, so that if they're working within a feature, they can actually validate that they did not regress back to anything by actually by using the tests that we've created for them. But we can't do that if they're not centralized, or if they're those monolithic test runs that we were talking about on the previous slide. So let's look at the second wrong task. And again, and I don't want the term wrong to necessarily indicate that if any of these things are being practiced in your organization now, that they are actually wrong, that they're wrong for you. Each industry and each organization and company and team is going to have their unique differences in here, but these are just a way to start thinking about, if this is how you currently are using test automation and this is your approach, you may want to revisit and see if that's actually going to be able to support DevOps, or if it's currently able to support DevOps, if you're, again, practicing DevOps and it's already a part of your organization. So then we look at automation at sprint plus end. So what does that mean? So generally speaking, if we employ what we like to call the middleman strategy, where a tester is getting a story, they're testing that story, and then they may move that story to ready for automation task. And those stories may queue up, and we have then a big backlog of automation that needs to happen for either test cases or stories. And in a lot of cases, what that means is that work will roll over to the next sprint, or in some cases to multiple sprints, so that we're never actually keeping up with the test automation within the sprint. And so I kind of address that by saying that we should be looking at considering automation as part of our shippable components, as part of what we mean by being able to be shipped. And so I'll talk a little bit about, a little bit in detail about what I mean by shippable. But really what we want to do is our focus is to, especially within DevOps, our focus is to work on smaller components and to get those to the point where they are shippable, versus looking at it in a siloed way of, well, this piece of work is dev complete, and then it moves down to the next column, and now this piece of work is QA complete, and then it moves to the next column, and then it's ready to release. But a lot of times when we're siloed in that capacity, we don't really have a shared responsibility of, okay, our individual responsibilities are complete from a dev standpoint. It's designed, everything looks good, it's been accepted by our product owner or product manager. But then there are all of those different activities and tasks that actually need to be incorporated to make it shippable so that it can then be continuously deployed. And again, DevOps and CI/CD essentially go hand in hand. So again, I'll give a little bit more detail on what shippable means, but we want to start considering anything that has been designated as being should be automated from a testing standpoint should then be considered as part of that shippable. So therefore, it is not shipping without it being automated. So then we move into the third task here, non-automated or scripted testing first, right? So what I mean, I generally like to say that, we can kind of categorize our testing activities into two components, scripted or unscripted testing. And scripted testing is really anything that is centralized, written down, and ideally repeatable and consistent. Anything that's unscripted, we're talking about more exploratory and ad hoc, where we're exploring the software, and we may have a goal or an outcome for a session when we're exploring the software, but we're really kind of using our creative license and our information that we've brought to the table to really kind of perform, a well thought out scripted session or unscripted session based testing effort. But what we generally tend to do is once we get work that's ready for testing, we tend to run those scripted test cases first, right? So those are the things that, again, if we share those with dev, those should have been considered by dev, and therefore will likely have a lower probability of finding bugs in that. We know historically that exploratory and unscripted types of testing will yield the most new bugs as we're going through there. So when we think about what types of testing we execute at the time that we get code or stories or pieces of work from development to start testing, we tend to focus on those non-automated scripted test cases first. So what I'm suggesting is that we talk about unscripted testing first. Explore those stories, explore that code that dev has just given you, because we know that those are going to yield more bugs at that time. If you're finding that scripted tests, whether they're automated or not automated, yield a lot of bugs, that tends to mean that there may be some regressions, and that development or the engineering team may need to address something on their end to either stop or significantly eliminate the types of regression. And we can help that way by, again, making those tests available and centralized to the team, starting out with that TDD mindset, test-driven development mindset, and sharing those tests, right? So we're going to share those tests. We're going to make it as easy as possible for the teams to the left of us to validate their own work, so that by the time the QA or QE team gets that code, we're actually exploring the software first. And then we have redundancy, right? So a lot of times we simply just either haven't asked, or we don't know what types of quality or testing checks are happening within our engineering team. I've worked with some fabulous developers and engineers that when their own individual quality checks, they will test their own code very, very thoroughly. So by the time I've gotten to running my scripted tests, I know that they've actually looked at them, and not only did they incorporate that when they've written that code, but they're also running those tests in some capacity on their own. Again, we always want to make sure that we're balancing that the scripted and the unscripted testing the same way that we balance the technical acumen and the user advocacy. And redundancy is one of those areas that, in a lot of ways, if we don't have any insight into what the individual devs, or as part of their code review or pull request approver situation, we may not have any understanding of what is happening from the dev standpoint. So then we take it upon ourselves to test everything. And a lot of times that then kind of introduces redundant testing, which of course, redundancy may lead to inefficient ways to go through. So we want to always avoid inefficient things like redundancy. And for those of you who may be engineers or developers that are listening to the webinar, we want to make sure if we share those tests, we want to make sure that dev reads those tests as well. All right. So refinement. So I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of when we were introducing some of the topics that we'll be talking about today. We talked about refinement. And again, ideally, most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with some of the Agile ceremonies. We have tended to not put as much emphasis on the refinement or the grooming session that comes in. And I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about what we consider old school refinement, right? And so we would have, maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours, or in some cases a half a day of a refinement session where the entire project team plus the lurkers, and what I mean by lurkers are maybe some people who have nothing to do with the team, but they may be, maybe they're executives or C-levels. They just want to listen in and maybe from time to time chime in, right? And so anytime, as somebody that doesn't have a lot of information on what's going on, if they're chiming in, they may either chime in with wrong information, or it may kind of stop some of the progress that the team has during that time. So when we looked at what refinement means, it's usually with the entire project team. And so we may be refining a couple of stories at one time. And if a developer or a QA is not responsible for that story, they're probably going to check out at something. They're going to go check their Facebook, they're going to go work on some other things. And so we've lost the attention and we've lost the collaboration by having these huge monolithic, to use that term again, refinements. So one thing to look at, if that's been a situation that you've been involved in where the refinement meetings just have not been able to provide as much value as they should because they're too big or because we don't have the right attendees in there, consider looking at small working groups. We've had a lot of success by simply having smaller working groups where it is represented by that product owner that can speak to the desire of what the outcome and the MVP of that story is. You have your developer or developers there talking about their initial plan of approach on how they're going to start coding that, anything to think of, and then QA or QE comes in and design comes in to talk about how they're going to approach that as well. QA and QE should be thinking about and speaking to some of their testing approaches in that smaller working group type of refinement meeting. And what winds up happening is that you have a much more accurate understanding of not only the time it may take to complete all of that work, not just the dev work. Again, the idea is that small working groups with everyone that has responsibility for doing something on that story is there and present and speaking. But it really kind of makes it a much more efficient way of getting, and you get a lot more information, and you're able to then start talking about, well, then what, after all of our work is complete, what then do we need to do to make that a shippable thing if and when we're ready to ship it? So then we start thinking about then kind of old school, right? So then we move it, we're cramming as many stories as possible in an hour or an hour and a half, right? And so, we have to take advantage of having the entire project team in this room. So the idea here is to try and get everything technically refined or groomed in that 1 hour versus really focusing in on a couple of stories. So when we talk about kind of having everyone represented, that third bullet point under the new school refinement, again, I kind of focused on this, but in this situation, if DevOps has responsibility on tasks within a story, that they're also present in that smaller working group session, and it's a shorter time. We've had lots of success by scheduling 15 to 30-minute sessions where we've actually been able to refine several user stories and to a much higher quality and alignment than we had ever been able to do in those more monolithic hour-long meetings where everybody in the room is there and we're losing most people's attention if we're not talking about something that they're specifically responsible for. And then we kind of come back to that tiered approach, and you'll notice that I'm a fan of the tiered approach, right? We may have to come back and refine again at some point. But the idea is that it's not a one and done effect. Once you've sat in that room for 1 hour and that story is considered refined by one or two people, generally speaking, that then makes it into the backlog of getting ready to plan for a sprint. Especially if you're focusing on an agile kind of scrum or sprint planning session, versus the newer school refinement and the tiered approach says, yes, we may have gotten a lot of information, valuable information during that small working groups refinement session, but there may be a need to come back and revisit it again and again, maybe a little bit less formal and more ad hoc. But the idea is that if one person is questioning or has questions or doesn't have what he or she needs in order to do their work, then the refinement shouldn't really be considered complete. So when we talk about shippable, and this is kind of where we're talking a little bit more of the details in here. So we've had this term called definition of done, and that used to be owned by the product, whether it's the product owner or the product organization or product manager, whatever product looks like in your organization. And it used to mean, or it does still mean, of course, that it's the definition of done as it pertains to MVP or sprint. Did we get this sprint done, and what does that mean? I liked, and we've repurposed this definition of done, and we now have kind of brought that into each practice or team within the Agile team. So when you start thinking about the pillars of an Agile project team, we tend to think of a Scrum Master, a QA or QE, a developer, a designer, and a product manager. And your company may have different pillars, but when you start thinking about who is generally represented within an Agile project team, those are generally it. And again, you can kind of you add or remove people that are not representative within your company. But the idea here is that when we start talking about the definition of done, each practice has a playbook of when they move something from column to column, what are all of the things that they are either required to do or that are central and consistent across their engineers. And that kind of then makes it the definition of done playbook. I have a lot of sample, or I have a sample, I should say, an example of what this looks like from a QA or QE team. And really, the benefits of having a definition of done playbook at the practice level is that it removes the guesswork. So when a story moves from the in development column into ready for test or whatever that next column looks like in your world, it removes the guesswork. We don't necessarily have to say, well, where was it unit tested? What are the standards around unit testing? Was it code reviewed? What does that look like? So instead of us guessing, and then therefore, if we don't know the answer to that, we then tend to add more and more and more tests to which then, of course, it introduces more redundancy. We remove the guesswork because the definition of done becomes the playbook. And for all intents and purposes, it becomes the agreement that practice or that team says, hey, as part of our own organization, these are the things that we do, and these are the things that will happen all of the time. And if something in this playbook does not happen, it's our responsibility to let you know when and why. And again, this then starts instilling a lot more efficient and innovative ways to then move things through quicker through the pipeline and support the CI/CD component of DevOps. So so when we start looking again at making things shippable, things that we should be considering as tech debt is addressed. So again, when we look at shippable, we get to the main components of saying not only are each practices work done and all of the things that from a dev and a design and a scrum master and a product owner and a QA or QE responsibilities, not only are those done, but it becomes the red bow on top of it saying, and now we are ready to ship. A lot of times, so many times we miss that component of saying, okay, what then do we need to do to make it shippable? And then we actually create those as either part of tasks within the user story, or we make those as part of the acceptance of that story, as well as the acceptance of that sprint or that work that's eventually going to be deployed out there, right? So when we think about making things shippable, we want to make sure that tech debt is addressed, both from the development side and from the QA side. And if as QA or QE professionals, tech debt is not something that you track, I would highly encourage you to do that, because there's a lot of tech debt that is generated from QA and QE, just naturally as part of software development. But the idea is that we want to make sure that that is addressed, and we can address that in a couple of ways. But the key is to make sure that if we've incurred tech debt, it's better to address it as real time as possible, even if by addressing it means that we've created a story so that that information does not get lost. Other things that we should be considering when we make things shippable: automation is green and it's in the pipeline. So it's not enough to say that we've run our automated suites or tests and they're running green and they're passing in our QA environment, but that should be tied for all areas within the pipeline. And so by the time everything is running green, that should be an indicator that you are ready to ship. Other things that we should be considering are that we shouldn't have any if Sev 1 or Sev 2 bugs that are open. And if we do, there should be a very good reason why, and that should be well known across the team. And then from any of our scripted test cases, anything that we've designated as priority 1 or 2 test cases are in a passing state. Of course, we want all bugs to be closed, and we want all of our tests that have been designated as being passing. But when we start thinking about more data-driven concepts to get something to shippable, these are ways that we can get closer to that. So final thoughts on kind of making something shippable. Hopefully this will resonate with some of you. Just because you can ship doesn't mean that you should. And just because you could might not mean you did. And the reason, and kind of those fluffy words here are really just making sure that even if we don't ship that particular story at the time of its true completion and it's in its shippable status, we are kind of then introducing good behaviors so that whenever we are ready to ship, that we can. And so these are kind of good reminders on making sure that we start implementing and introducing the shippable concept for all of the areas within our practices, and certainly within that time when that story finally makes it from into that last column, that we've actually put that red bow on top, and that if we could ship, if we needed to ship it, we could. Okay, so I'll just kind of keep this summary slide up here. This is what we talked about. We defined the QE role. We talked about retuning the automation, shifting some of those traditional tasks that have been solely focused on to the right of the pipeline to the left. Maybe looking at redefining the refinement meeting and having it as shorter working sessions with all people responsible for doing work there. And then incorporating and introducing the term shippable to really kind of replace the new definition of done. Okay, so with that said, I'll kind of hand it over to Smita to see if there are any questions that I might be able to answer in the last 10 minutes of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It was actually a very insightful session, and we do have quite a few questions. So I'm going to try to take as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. Okay. So the first one is here. Are you suggesting for dev to run regression test? I believe this is about your shift left slide.
Yes, I am. And the ways that we can do that, and again, ways that we can see that successful is if we start thinking about feature-based smoke tests or feature-based automation that's going to make sense. So whether they're scripted in an automated tool or framework, or whether they're scripted in a more traditional test case management tool where they would kind of, the output would be test cases. Yes, I'm suggesting that we at least give the development team the opportunity to validate that they have not regressed with their code, instead of it then waiting for QA or QE to get to it, and then even in a lot of cases waiting until the very, very end of the cycle in order to ensure regression. Regression testing, in my opinion, should be as shifted as far left to the developers as possible, but without making those tests central and available to the devs, and without showing the value to the development team, the developers tend to have those tasks waiting until QA or QE gets to it. So yes, I am suggesting that in some cases that at least running those smoke tests to validate that they didn't break any critical functionality, we can start introducing, shifting that left by starting out small. But it's certainly where the most successful teams, especially startups or so that may not have a formal QA or QE team in place, where dev is responsible or the project team is responsible for getting for doing traditional QA and QE tasks, that's been critical. And so even with my role with Rainforest, there's a lot of companies that we've advised with that approach to make those tests centralized so that the dev team can actually validate that they have not regressed versus waiting until the end for QA or QE to do that.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So the next question here is, Melissa, what approach do you recommend when starting to automate a feature? So is it automating the manual test scripts or some other approach such as modeling the app and using a test engine against the model?
That's a great question. So I'm not necessarily a fan of automating the test cases. That then kind of goes back to that middleman strategy where, where a test was created and then checked marked somewhere to say, okay, now automate this test. I'm much more a fan of whoever has that test automation skill set should be able to weigh in at that time of refinement, ideally, to be able to determine what should be. But when we start thinking about an approach to automating, say, a feature, the first thing that I ask is what has dev automated on their end from a unit or integration testing standpoint, and is there going to be redundancy there, or is it thorough enough that we could actually use those results to then kind of create a more comprehensive automation strategy? But if the idea is that we want to automate more of a traditional smoke test feature, I tend to start out by using the CRUD approach. So if we were to look at, say, a login feature or something like that, I would simply just write down CRUD, create, read, update, delete. And if all of the actions that are applicable to that feature, I would write that test or automated script to satisfy the action of create, read, update, delete. And so that's how I've started. And that is, again, kind of the basic building blocks of tests, to where then that is, it's when you run that particular test, you're going to get results in sub-seconds. And again, when we start shifting that to the left and we let dev know that we've got some tests that they can run on their own, we want to make it as small as possible, but with as much value and as quickly as possible to get them that right information. So the approach that I would start out with is a smoke test following that CRUD approach, and then building off of that, given your unique situation within your company.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense again, that it's actually probably one solution is not fit for all. So you could definitely start at smoke, but looking at your specific requirements, we could model them.
Absolutely.
When would be the appropriate time for triage and their outcomes in agile practices?
When we talk about triage, and I'm assuming TRIAGE, is that the word?
Please excuse me for my pronunciation.
No, that's okay. No, there are a lot of components for triage. So I just want to make sure I get the question again. Will you read that one more time for me, Smita?
Yes. When would be the appropriate time for triage and their outcomes in agile practices? I believe it is bug triage.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. So I think, I personally think daily, and some of you may be like, "Oh my gosh, that's too much." But if daily, if you have a standard kind of 15-minute Scrum, and if you're running those Scrum, meetings correctly, a lot of times there are a few minutes left over. The idea, though, for a stand-up or a Scrum meeting is not to get out of there as quickly as possible. It's to present the appropriate information at that right time, so people know how to either start their day or the next things that they're going to do. So if you are adopting that type of a stand-up approach, I've seen triages of bugs where they're literally part of that stand-up, and you could go through a 2 to 3 minute exercise of triaging the bugs that have come in. I've also seen a lot of success with doing those, maybe a little bit more expanded, 2 to 3 times a week or 1 day a week. But the idea is that somebody who I'm a big fan of using a two-pronged approach for defect triage. One is, of course, the severity, which is pretty binary. A bug either meets a Sev 1, 2, 3, 4, how many classifications you have in your severities. It either meets that criteria or it doesn't. A lot of times we tend to blend in both severity and priority when we are writing bugs, and I would encourage you to really kind of use that binary approach to saying, does it meet this criteria? And if so, it becomes that severity bug. And then the triage happens when whoever is responsible for prioritizing the work for that team, whether it's a product manager or somebody similar, then they come in and they put that priority on top of that. So then they're actively looking at the severity and the priority, and you have just a deeper way to look at not only the severity of the bug, but its importance and when that work will begin. So I would encourage probably minimum of weekly, but you can kind of incorporate that into your 16th minute or some, kind of bake it into a couple of shorter sessions, much like I encourage having shorter, smaller working sessions for refinement. I would say the same holds true for bug triage.
All right, so we'll go to the next question. Can you share the QA/QE playbook example you mentioned?
I can. I will share that. If you, all of my contact information is on the slide. If you reach out to me, I will give you the example of what we've created for a definition of done. I'd be happy to do that.
And there is another attendee who wants to know more information on A. So can they reach out to you too?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So the next question here is, how do you see requirements, business, functional, and non-functional, being documented? Are they strictly in user stories or official documentations similar or hybrid of traditional waterfall SDLC?
For teams or companies that are highly regulated and where you need a lot of specifications or requirements, those tend to be housed in more document management, so like larger documentation repositories or management. In a perfect world, we would be able to reference all of the residual information within the user story itself. So when if say, for example, if Jira is your tool for project management, I would say it's always best to at least refer to either a link to that document or using the acceptance criteria in the user story itself, to kind of use that story as the centralized repository, not necessarily to house documents, especially if we get into, hundreds of pages of specifications and requirements. That's not going to be appropriate to put in the user story, but you could at least put a link there. So I think there's a lot to be said for organizing documentation within that Jira ticket, and having some standards and templates around how to actually create a well thought out ticket or card in Jira to make sure it houses the appropriate information.
Thanks, Melissa. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask you just one last question and be quickly done with it. There are quite a few more questions which are still coming in. But as we said, all the questions that remain unanswered, they will be taken up with Melissa later on, and she will send us the responses and we'll publish them. So this one last question here is quickly about tech debt. So there are quite a few of them. So I'm going to ask you all of them put together. So when you say tech debt is generated by QA/QE, what do you mean? And how do you recommend tracking tech debt, especially QE tracking it?
Yeah, so it really the way that I consider it is something that should have been done, but doesn't necessarily represent MVP or minimal viable product, could be considered tech debt. And so it really is left up. So a good example of tech debt would be so cleanup of automation, right? Where we may have put in, written a script that may not be as efficient or optimized as possible. And so an example of tech debt in that situation would be optimize this script. And so in that situation, the way that I would recommend it, if it cannot be addressed right then and there, then I would create a story. And I encourage anyone on the team should have the ability to create a story and be able to speak to the story and its priority or its importance if and when asked by whoever actually owns the prioritization of the backlog. So it is literally as soon as that. So if I generate tech debt, especially given that situation where I want to optimize the script a little bit more, but I don't have time to do it in this sprint, I'm going to write a story that or a task or something in there, and then I'm going to work with my product counterpart to make sure that that importance is understood so that it could then be prioritized in the next round of work, whether it's that sprint after or in a designated tech debt sprint, which I've seen a lot of success with companies. That's generally how I approach that.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Melissa. It was a very insightful session on the QA role in the DevOps world. And many thanks for sharing all the details. That really helps a lot. I'm sure our attendees found it very useful and informative. So thanks again, Melissa, and I hope to see you in San Francisco.
Thank you. See everybody at STP Con.
So, well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today, and thank you for joining. More importantly, thanks for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and the whole group. If you want to see more such sessions from speakers like Melissa and others, and wish to learn more about testing, do come over to STP Con Spring 2019. Stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon at softwaretestpro.com. And if you haven't signed up yet for the upcoming webinar, which is AMA session, Ask Me Anything session with Michael Bolton on 27th February, then please do it. Please do send us your questions ASAP. And I believe the link is already up for registration, so please go ahead. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in San Francisco in April 2019. Keep practicing your testing skills, everything that you learn here. So, thank you.